So thank you everyone for joining us. We have a pretty small group here with us on Zoom directly today, so I'm hoping that it can be a pretty intimate conversation. I am Donna Murphy, and I am one of the co-founders of Prognosis, which is a company that provides free and low-cost support to family caregivers of people living with dementia. And we have with us today Maggie Moon, who is a nutritionist who's written a fabulous book called The Mind Diet. We have a picture of the book right here. She has the second edition coming out right now. Has recipes also for people to look at when we're thinking about the many things that we can do to prevent cognitive decline. That can be actually just age-related cognitive decline, but can also be dementia, which is a diagnosis, right? A clinical diagnosis, and that is a degenerative disease that can leave a person very dependent on their families often. So for both of those purposes, really, just for maintaining brain health with aging, especially, and also for delaying the progression of dementia where it exists already, or preventing its onset. We wanted to talk about the Mind Diet, but specifically from the perspective of adaptations that we can make to this diet that allow for us to honor our own cultural traditions in terms of the foods that we eat. And we'll go over why that is important actually for our overall well-being. So yeah, I don't know, Maggie, if you want to say anything additionally here before we get started. We have basically about 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes of questions for Maggie. And then we will have questions from the audience. So the people who are on the Zoom call, I'll try to also look at Facebook to see if any folks are posting questions there. And at the end, we will have, the ability for you to get some of this information if you provide us with your email address, if we don't have that from registration, so that you can use this as a reference for yourself. Yeah, so Maggie, anything that you wanted to add before we get started here?
Well done. I just really appreciate being here. And I actually love this intimate setting because I hope that we can have some open conversations and answer any questions that people have. Usually I'm in a setting with much larger audiences and we don't get to everyone's questions. So this is a very, I feel very good about having the opportunity to do that. The other thing I wanted to share is just a little housekeeping is that I'm getting over a summer cold. And so I may occasionally mute myself to have a little dry cough to myself. So I apologize for that in advance.
Thank you so much for joining us, even though you're feeling a bit under the weather. Okay, so the first question that I have, and this is like one coming from especially like my perspective as a neuroscientist, as somebody who is always looking at data, and I know that your book is very focused on that. What is the strongest quality evidence that we have that specific foods can enhance cognitive function?
Right. So that's actually where the Mind Diet came from. It came from observational data that we saw around the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. And we saw that there were hints that this was going to be good. We already knew it was good for heart health. And then we saw some associations with brain health. And that's really what was one of our first clues from a research perspective, that we could combine these two and take elements and see what was going to be the strongest in terms of brain health. So I just want to say at the outset, I know your question was which foods, and I'll share a couple of the top foods, but it's really about the overall diet pattern. What are we eating throughout the whole day and throughout the whole week and the month and the years? And so it really is about what are we doing habitually? What are we doing consistently, rather than specific foods? But of course, that overall dietary pattern is made up of specific foods. So really the strongest data on specific foods. The strongest data on an overall diet is the Mind Diet, and there's some other ways as well, but they're just, there are over 150 papers on the Mind Diet. But on specific foods, I would say that the strongest data is around leafy green vegetables, cruciferous vegetables. So those are two very strong associations with those two vegetable classes and better brain health, slowing down cognitive decline and also reducing the risk of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And then we have a lot of data on specifically walnuts, probably because they are the only nut that is a rich and excellent source of the omega-3 ALA. And I do work with walnuts on some education, so I wanted to mention that. So the leafy greens, the cruciferous vegetables, walnuts in particular in the nut class. And then I would say that that the olive oil and the vegetable oil, the olive oil as a vegetable oil is also has a lot of good data behind it. And berries, specific berries and berries in general have been found to individually, slow down cognitive aging, whether it's like 2 years or 5 years, and all of this adds up so that the overall pattern can be helpful.
That's super helpful. I mean, I think a lot of people learn from each other, from things that they read on the internet about specific things that they can do. And I think that the perception often is that like, it doesn't matter how they're eating in general, as long as they incorporate those very specific things, they can, reverse the unhealthy effects, I guess, about
Yeah.
the balance of what they're eating, which is just not true. So it's helpful to hear that this is more about a pattern of eating and incorporating some of these things that we do have data on. But it's more of a behavior overall it's important to think about. I realized that I didn't give some background on kind of why we're approaching this topic in this way. And I wanted to give a little bit of the background. And I want to say here that a lot of this data is actually pulled from slides that Maggie provided to us, that she also took from publicly available resources here, which I've cited according to her citations. So I just wanted to give this as a bit of a backdrop, because as we go into some of these questions, we'll find that a lot of the questions that I've chosen have to do with the specific impacts of dietary choices on the brain health of people from our communities, right? So these are specifically communities of color. And the reason I've chosen to focus on this is both because I have a personal interest as somebody who is from a community of color, and because if we look at the demographic changes in this country, our aging population is more and more people from communities of color. And so this graph is illustrating, and that there are some intersectional challenges that they face, right? So this graph is illustrating in the cyan or the blue color, and that for these different demographic groups, right, racial ethnic groups, or racial groups in this case, we see that there is a tremendous amount of growth in the number of people who are, or the percentage of people who are over the age of 65 in communities of color relative to the people who are white. These are changes that will be happening in the next 20, 25 years, right? 65 plus, those who are in poverty, right, in those age groups, as we get older, that also is disproportionately increasing for our communities of color. That, in terms of the choices that we make for what we eat, it really does, I think, shape our choices, because some kinds of foods are more expensive, are less accessible in some of our communities because of things like food deserts. So it's important, I think, to think about these changing demographics and what that means to our families and the choices that we make, right? The context that we have for making those choices. Here I wanted to say briefly that dementia specifically is something that has greater incidence in people who are African American. We see twice the incidence of dementia. In people who are Latino, I think pretty consistently, we're seeing about 1.5 times the incidence of dementia. People who are Indigenous, there's not as much data, and it's a little bit equivocal, I guess, but it does appear to be on balance that is also, there's greater incidence for people who are Indigenous. And for Asian American people, it's hard to know because a lot of our data is not disaggregated. So we look at Asian Americans as this huge umbrella category, and we are very distinct in our foods, in our behaviors, in our socioeconomic circumstances as groups, like subgroups within that umbrella designation. And without disaggregating, it's hard to know. But there's some suggestion that some groups within that umbrella category have greater incidence of dementia and the things that would put you at risk for dementia than others. Also, language accessibility is poorer for people who come from these immigrant communities, right? Because a lot of information, a lot of access to diagnosis, counsel, care community is in English. And so that really is limiting for not just our Asian Americans, but also our Latino immigrants as well. Dementia cases are expected to increase 7-fold for those who are Latino and 4-fold for those who are African American by 2060. So again, we're seeing a disproportionate growth in, so not just the incidence in this moment, but a disproportionate growth of the incidence of dementia with time. And then finally, I wanted to make the point that access to culturally fluent counsel, including counsel on how we can eat in healthier ways, is rare. And this is why we were very motivated to look at this issue with respect to diet today. So let me go on. I'll leave it on this slide for the moment. People can kind of peruse that. It's a little bit information dense, but let me go on to our next question here so that we can kind of move into the questions more specifically about cultural adaptations of the MIND diet. And this is another question I think that comes up often, I think across cultures, honestly, from my conversations with caregivers. What is the risk of taking supplements, the risk or benefit of taking supplements like fish oil or turmeric instead of getting nutrients from whole foods?
That's a great question, Donna. And every caregiver that I've ever spoken to will agree that there is no substitute for a healthy diet. So the word supplement is about adding to something. And that's really that's how we should be thinking about supplements. If there is a true gap, many of us are actually vitamin D insufficient or deficient, which has an impact on our immune health. So if there is a true gap, then yes, a supplement is going to help bridge that gap. But if you don't have that gap to begin with, then you don't need a supplement. Also, the number one way to address our nutrient needs is always going to be better, almost always, and I'll tell you why I said almost, is going to be better coming from food, because we are still unlocking in the nutrition science world all of the benefits that come from that food matrix. So those nutrients that are together in a package of food, you've on a very simplistic level, you can think about how you're getting vitamins and minerals in a piece of fruit along with that fiber. So, you are getting something along with it in that healthy package. So that's one reason to enjoy the whole food. So there's no substitute for a healthy diet, but the question is about supplements. So I do want to address that. There are some supplements, vitamins and minerals in supplement form that are more easy to absorb in our older age. Vitamin B12 is a perfect example, but by and large, we can get everything we need from food. Now, do we have perfect diets all the time? That's a different question. Do we have access to all the foods that will provide us all the vitamins and minerals and nutrients and phytonutrients that we need? That's another question. So if we're not getting everything we need, then we do need to supplement. And so what I would say is that if there is that underlying need rather, then maybe something like a simple, humble multivitamin can help fill in those gaps, unless you are specifically deficient in like a specific nutrient, and then you would work with your health professional on filling that. Now, the AARP and the Global Council for Brain Health, they don't recommend any supplement in terms of brain health benefit. Now, their recommendation is based on a consensus statement from a few years back, and actually some more recent data has come out since then. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how they update that and if they update that. But in general, Donna, the thing about nutrition is that everything happens in a U-shaped curve. So, maybe I should make an upside down U. So you're at great health, kind of like right in the middle. And then you got some bandwidth on either end of when you're a little lower, a little higher in a nutrient than what you need for your overall well-being. But when you get to the extremes, something negative is more likely to happen, whether it is deficiency or toxicity. So you don't want to go overboard. And the thing about supplements, specific individual supplements, is you've got a greater opportunity or risk of going overboard on a single nutrient. So that's, to me, the greatest risk. And there are a lot of supplements out there making claims that are not all backed up. There was a great review paper on the data so far on different supplements, and a handful do have interesting, promising findings. But then there are a whole bunch more that the data is mixed or the data is negative, and but they're still on the market. And so it's really about choosing food first, going with something prudent like a basic multivitamin, and then working with your health professional on anything else.
That's, I think, going to be a continuing theme here.
Yeah.
Yeah, about being kind of more holistic, I think, in our approach to these things. So my next question for you actually, I think, is pertinent to this slide here, or will maybe help us to kind of introduce what the information on this slide. And that is, how strong a role does diet play in preventing or mitigating neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, relative to the heritable risk?
Yeah. This is a great question because there are things that certainly put us at increased risk: aging, family history, right? We can't do anything about that. And so, fortunately, excuse me, the heritable risk is a much lower percentage than the things that we can do. So there are several modifiable risk factors, and these are things that we can do something about. And so that's where we need to focus anyway. The CDC estimates that 40% of Alzheimer's could be prevented with lifestyle. We know that with Alzheimer's, maybe 1% is caused by some sort of deterministic gene. So perhaps the potential is even greater for prevention. When it comes to Parkinsonism, 10 to 15% is considered most likely to be from some kind of genetic link, which leaves a whole lot more space for changing the environment, and changing the diet is part of that. So the slide you have up here is essentially a summary of the Mind Diet recommendations. And this has been seen in an observational study, so not a randomized clinical trial, but an observational study found to reduce the risk of dementia by over half, by 53%, and to slow down cognitive decline by 7.5 years. So this is an association at this point, and that's kind of the best data we have at this point.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, how much emphasis is placed on heritable risk and like genetics of this disease. Like I maybe it was about a year or two ago, I think there are a couple of interviews that I did. They were CBS News interviews. They were super interested in ApoE4 and like who had this genetic risk for this disease. And it's, I think, actually a bit dangerous to really like have that dominate the narrative on these disorders, because people think they can't do anything about it, right? They think, and I think they conflate some of those strong genetic risk factors with the kind of like polygenetic risk that most of us have, right? It's like this, we have a susceptibility. That's what polygenetic basically means for like a layperson, right? We have a susceptibility, but not like a very strong, like you will absolutely get this. And we misinterpret that heritable risk as the stronger thing many times. And there's just, I don't know. I think when you feel like there's nothing you can do about it, there is no action that you will take. And that's really unfortunate, because look, I mean, if this slide here is showing you can make different choices here that can have really dramatic, potentially really dramatic impact on your risk,
So I think that's 100% right. There is, even a genetic marker like the ApoE marker you're talking about is not a death sentence. It's not mean that you're going to ever develop Alzheimer's. It can be very misleading. And like you said, there's nothing you can do about that anyway. But there is so much you can do outside of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on
that. Another question that I have is, because I think so much of our diet is unfortunately dominated by processed foods, how do processed foods and artificial additives impact brain health, particularly chronic exposure, right, over time?
Right. So it's very clear. We see that the best diet pattern for us is one that is rich in plant foods, which is different than a diet that's going to be rich in ultra processed foods. Now, there's a lot of conversation in the ether about ultra processed and processed foods right now, because of some of the recent reports that have come out. Excuse me. And I think it's important for everyone to know that the processing itself is not a problem, but it is that when foods are ultra processed, they are more likely to be devoid of nutrients and not supportive of brain health. But let me just give you an example. I believe tofu is considered ultra processed according to this guideline, this framework of how to define processed foods. And tofu is a food that's been enjoyed for centuries, millennia, and is actually quite healthful. So it's about like, don't focus so hard on the processing, but yes, there is a correlation because many ultra processed foods are quite detrimental to health. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a nuance that people just need to use a little bit of common sense. And so looking at foods that are more wholesome, closer to their natural state is a great rule of thumb. But also, if you're a caregiver and your patient is really craving something from their childhood that might be a processed snack or something like that, then maybe you just give them a little bit of it because it's going to bring them joy, but within the context of an overall healthy diet, so that most of their food does come from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean poultry, seafood, things like that.
That makes a lot of sense. Just looking at this slide and thinking about the many different kinds of diets that people suggest that we be on for various health benefits. Another one that has been pretty popular, and I think that there is a fair amount of evidence for in terms of its health impact in many ways, is intermittent fasting. So I wanted to ask you what you thought the potential cognitive benefits were of intermittent fasting relative to dietary patterns, like changing of dietary patterns, like we would recommend in the Mind diet or the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah, so intermittent fasting, just for anyone who may not know, does not focus really on any type of food. It's all about timing. And so it's, not eating for a certain number of hours and then eating all of your food for the day in, say, like a 5-hour period, or even fasting for like 1 day a week. There are many forms of intermittent fasting. It's about on again, off again, and giving the body a little bit of a break from digestion because, processing food is work for the body. So it's about giving the body some rest. And there is some data around intermittent fasting supporting overall well-being as well as brain health. Some of that data is in a clinical setting. From my point of view, from a practitioner's point of view, it may not always be practical for everyone to get all of their nutrition in within a finite number of hours. So it really depends on how you are approaching the intermittent fasting diet. And for me, it's all about how do we get the right foods and the right nutrients into the patient's body in a way that they will enjoy, and that will make them feel good about their food choices. So it is an option, but I would say that the data is really actually limited at this point. So several different dietary patterns, including intermittent fasting, have been studied for lowering the risk of Alzheimer's, and many of these other foodways have been, there's just not that much data. So that's kind of like the TLDR, that's the shortcut. That's the bottom line. There's just not a lot of data there. The best data is around the Mind diet and the Mediterranean diet for brain health.
Is there anything else that, let me see actually my next slide, because I can't remember what it was. Oh, this is moving into kind of the conversation about heritage foods and the Mind diet. Is there anything else that we want to cover in terms of the MIND diet actually being a combination of the Mediterranean diet with the DASH diet? Is there something that we haven't discussed here before we kind of move into a conversation about how we can actually adapt these things, these recommendations?
Yeah, I think that, oh, sorry, what was the second part?
Oh, no, sorry, and why that's important to actually make
And
some
what?
adaptations according to our own heritages. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for anyone on the call or who may be watching this later who may not be familiar with the MIND diet, it's helpful to know that it's an acronym, so MIND, and that M stands for Mediterranean and DASH, and the rest of it is intervention for neurodegenerative delay. And it comes from a research study that saw that the Mediterranean and the DASH diet, which are known for being heart healthy diets already that have been studied in the scientific literature, we saw associations with better brain health outcomes. And so that's where the MIND diet comes from. It's really only been in the published literature since 2015, so for about 10 years. So that's where it comes from. And what the MIND diet did was it combined those two heart healthy diets in a way that optimized the overall pattern for brain health by uplifting and emphasizing the specific foods that the overall state of the science suggested would be helpful for brain health. So uplifting leafy greens, uplifting berries, things like that. So that's what the MIND diet is about. And so it's already an adaptation of a US dietary pattern, right? Like that's DASH. And then more of a Eurocentric dietary pattern that's Mediterranean. What I like about the MIND diet is that it's really based around 10 food groups that we all want to eat more of, and 5 that we want to limit. And that's what was on that previous slide that you showed. And it's not about elimination, it's just about rebalancing how we eat those foods. But the reason I like the categories is that allows us to adapt to our own food preferences, our heritage food preferences, right? So vegetables, that's not saying you have to eat a vegetable specific to any culture. So you choose the vegetable that is specific to your own heritage. You choose the whole grains that's specific to your own heritage. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity here to adapt it to the way that we eat and the way that we prefer to eat and the way that's going to make us feel connected to our past, to our families, and to our friends.
Mm-hmm. Looking at this again and thinking about the things that we're not supposed to be eating, right? Or that we should be eating less of.
Yes.
So I have a big sweet tooth. And I know that in many cultures, across cultures, there are lots of sweet things that they eat in those
Yes.
different cultures, right?
Yes.
So my question here is, how significant is the impact of sugar and refined carbohydrates in general on brain health?
Yeah. Right. So there has been data that higher intakes of added sugar is linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's. That's the data we have. Again, this is an association, but it's pretty clear that added sugar is going to be pro-inflammatory, which is what we think is one of the underlying causes of so many chronic conditions, including Alzheimer's. So that inflammation, that chronic low-level inflammation, is really really driven by added sugar is one of the main drivers in our current diet. So yeah, one thing I'll say here is that reducing sort of the foods that we want to eat less of can be just as powerful as increasing the foods we want to eat more of. I like to focus on what we can eat more of because I feel like that naturally crowds out the space for what we want to eat less of, and focus on the positive. But yeah, it's important to know that if we have a ton of added sugar in our diet, we need to bring that back. And I'm not talking, by the way, about sugar and fruit. And I'm also not talking about having a slice of birthday cake on your birthday. Like these things you can work them in. It's all about balance, not about eliminating. It's about balance. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, that's great. What are some of the misconceptions that you have heard about brain foods in your own practice?
Well, gosh, the big one is around coconut oil. um, because coconut oil, within coconut oil, there is a something called a medium chain triglyceride that can fuel the brain with an alternate fuel source. And this is a theory behind, ketogenic diets. But the thing is that actual coconut oil is only partially um, that kind of oil, MCT oil. And so, um, yeah, it's just become a very popular misperception. But the fact is that coconut oil is so high in saturated fat, and saturated fat has a clear and direct line to increased cholesterol, which we know is going to be a risk factor for both heart health and for damaging brain health.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's super interesting. I know people who add that to their coffee, actually.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably with that, yeah, that misunderstanding. Okay, so to shift a little bit away from exclusively diet, right? I wanted to ask you whether you could tell us anything about how diet or whether diet has a strong independent influence on brain health relative to what you can do with weight and exercise, or is it just all like you can't really disentangle that?
Well, so yeah, that's such an interesting question. I don't think we should disentangle it because it is helpful to have all those lifestyle medicine pieces in place. But yes, diet alone, so controlling for, like research can control for um, exercise and other lifestyle habits, and diet alone has been shown to have an association with some of these benefits that we're talking about: slower brain aging, better cognitive function. So yes, diet alone absolutely helps. There is a study that came out earlier this year on overall biological aging, and overall biological aging incorporates all those other aspects that we're referring to, better sleep, managing stress, exercise, good diet. And it also found that it could explain some of the benefits around slower biological aging and better brain health, but it couldn't explain a lot of why the mind diet was working to support brain health and reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. So there's clearly a link directly with diet. With that said, in terms of what we can each do every single day, there are these 6 pillars for brain health that the Global Council for Brain Health has put out for us that we can all be doing. And a healthy diet is just one of them. And so it's going to be complementary, and it's going to build on the other habits of like sleeping well, moving regularly, managing stress, nourishing relationships, and also engaging the mind. So I think it's helpful to know in context that it's an important piece, but it's one piece of what we can and should be doing every day.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think for some people, it's maybe that, some kinds of lifestyle changes are more possible than others, or they can do more in some domains than others. And so I just wanted to ask, even if they can just do this,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, I think the answer is yes. And to your point, don't try to do all of these at once. Don't set yourself up for failure. That doesn't work. And even within dietary changes, start somewhere that is reasonable and feasible, practical for you. And so it will build, because you want to do something new until it becomes something that you don't even think about. And that's when it becomes a habit. That's when it becomes ingrained in you. And so, yes, I would do the small steps, and it truly, truly works, and it builds in that way. Like, I think a great place to start is snacks, because they're sort of an added, right? Like an added food throughout the day. So start with a healthier snack on nuts, snack on fruits, and then kind of build up from there.
Wonderful. That's really great practical advice. So I want to move on to just kind of give people a sense of, well, we didn't explicitly cover this slide, so let's maybe have you talk a little bit about this. And then I wanted to just kind of give people a preview of kind of what we've been thinking about in terms of how to make adaptations per the principles of the Mind Diet in each of our cultural foods.
Yes. So the slide here is referencing, I'm so sorry, is referencing a large review paper that looked at 63 different studies. And the reason this paper is so interesting is that they didn't just look at food and the brain from a biological perspective. They also brought in socio-psycho-economical, social, all these other aspects of who we are, because we're not just biology, we're also human beings that live in a society. And so they wove in some of those other aspects. And so what was so interesting about this study, and by the way, this study has to do with mental health, not so much cognitive health, but of course they're related. It's in the same organ. So this is about mental health. And what the study found was that immigrant populations in a Western civilization that were dealing with the stresses of being in a completely new and foreign culture, those who had access to their own cultural foods had overall higher ratings of self-esteem, more joy, feelings of contentment and well-being. So they had better mental health when they were able to access their own cultural foods. And I think that's really the takeaway. And the researchers were talking about how there's a sense of psychological safety that comes with these familiar foods, which of course makes so much sense because that's tied to when we feel connected to our elders and our family and our history. And so I think that's so powerful. I think the other piece to think about is that food was our first medicine. So if we go back, even if our today cultural diet isn't so hot in terms of health, if we go back maybe just even one generation, we can see that our heritage foods are so healthy because those are the whole foods we had access to, and those are the whole foods that sustained our societies and our cultures. And so I think any heritage food, any cultural foodway that you look back a generation or two, you're going to find a diet that is full of the right vitamins and nutrients and the fibers and everything that we need to support our health.
This is really great. I think it's very consistent with the way that we think about the modifiable risk factors in dementia, apart from just diet, which is not actually explicitly named. I think it comes up when we think about the things that produce obesity, that put you at risk for diabetes, for hypertension. Diet obviously is very important in mitigating that risk
Yes.
for those risk factors for dementia. But I think also what we're realizing more and more is some things that are not explicitly named there. And this is often, a study that gets cited by people. It's from Lancet Neurology, or it's a paper that gets cited by people that basically kind of like summarized all of the data that we have on these modifiable risk factors. They don't explicitly include their stress, right? And for our communities, that stress is it's racialized, right? It has to do with a lot of structural barriers to thriving, and looking at things more holistically in this way, just as they did in this paper, I think is super important for better understanding the challenges that we are facing and actually living healthier lives. So I super appreciate this. This is really great. I had not heard of this study, so it was really neat to see. And I totally agree with you that cognitive health and mental health, it's kind of like the mind brain, like dualism, right? How we've, I think thought for a long time, and a lot of people still think that those are two very distinct things. And
Yes.
the reality is those things live in the organ of the brain, like together. And so and also in dementia, depression, for instance, it's a risk factor. It's a named risk factor that is, again, modifiable for dementia. And it's also something that we conflate with dementia, right? Like we have to rule out that someone has dementia before we can say they have dementia, because it looks a lot like dementia in how it presents. And so yeah, I think those are really great points that you've made there. I wanted to show everyone these slides, and feel free to kind of screenshot them. If you, like I said, if you leave your email at the end, we'll have a QR code, and you can obtain also the same information in a different form, but it's the same information. What we asked people to do, and I think some of these people are actually on this call with us, is to just individuals who actually are in our communities, right? We kind of crowdsource this. We asked them to write down, these are people who attested to, cooking often, for themselves or for their families. Or they're chefs, actually. Some people were actually professionally chefs. And we asked them to write down all of the staples in each of these categories that Maggie mentioned today were important for the mind diet, right? And understanding what is healthy for you in the mind diet and how you should portion things in how you eat to optimize, right, your brain health there. We asked them, okay, what are the things in those categories within each of these categories of foods? So here we have some information about soul food. Here we have some information about Mexican food. And I have the person's name and their location at the bottom. These folks were all from Houston because we're predominantly in Houston at this moment. And then also for Korean food. And it's interesting to do this exercise, I think, because then you really can start to think about, what you do within your own heritage foods to really take advantage of the information we have from the Mind Diet. I wanted to ask you another question. We're running a little bit behind, I see. Hang on one second. It's been such a good conversation. So rather than making substitutions, right? What are some general principles to guide people on how to maximize their brain health with their heritage foods?
So can you ask the question another way?
Yeah, so it's like, we could say olive oil is the only oil that you should use. Right? It's like the Mediterranean diet says, right? So, rather than using your own, incorporating the maybe polyunsaturated oils within your own heritage foods, you're going to discard those and say, I'm just going to use olive oil. And that, changes what you're eating.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think actually what you touched on just now is the perfect example. So right. So this is where a little bit of know-how does come into play, where we need to realize that, olive oil is a little bit more specific to the Mediterranean region. And but what is it about olive oil and why was it included in the Mind Diet? It was included in the Mind Diet because it's traditionally part of the Mediterranean diet. It was also included in the Mind Diet because it's a dietary fat. It's more likely to help the balance of unsaturated to saturated fat overall. So with that framework, what other liquid vegetable oils can we include in the diet that's already part of our own food that will also help keep that balance of more liquid unsaturated fat to that solid saturated fat? And so the slide you have here is Korean food, and sesame oil, perilla oil, definitely fit the bill. Perilla oil is one I know, Donna, you and I have talked about because we're both Korean, and I came across this study and I just didn't know this before, but perilla oil is an amazing, like a very incredible source of omega-3 ALA. So plant-based omega-3. So people who are looking for their omega-3s from plants for whatever reason, maybe you want to be more plant forward, or maybe you are plant-based, vegetarian, whatever it is, it's an amazing source. It's a better source of omega-3s than flaxseed oil, which is another amazing source. So just knowing, like discovering that one of my heritage foods was actually so brain healthy for like a very valid evidence-based reason because of its nutrient profile, opened my eyes to the fact that there's so much we don't know, and there's so much we should be respecting about our heritage foods, because there's so much good information for ourselves in the food that fed our ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. I totally agree. And, there's just this bias, I think, across the board of like not incorporating what comes from any of our cultures, really, in like anything that we do in life, it seems. So I think that's why it's important to have like spaces like this where we can start to examine that critically and start to kind of reclaim, I guess, the things that our ancestors for a really long time knew work, like, so I want to end with this before we go into questions. If folks are interested in getting more information about, some of these different cultural heritage foods, I think right now, and again, this is a crowdsourced project. So also if you want to get involved, we have, I think, Nigerian food, also Ecuadorian food, which I think is common. There are lots of things there that are common about the Andean region from Ecuadorian food also. So Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, I think there's a lot of overlap as well. But if you're interested in getting that information also, please feel free to scan that QR code and you can get signed up. So I wanted to ask folks now if you have questions for Maggie. She also is available in the chat, I see. And just unmute, and we're a small group here, so feel free to just ask your question.
Hello, I have a question. Hi. I couldn't help but identify that wine was in the list of consume more.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was interesting because we are taught or we are told that alcohol is toxic. So why is it there?
Yeah. Natalia, great question. I'm actually really grateful that you noticed that, because it's a tricky one. So within the MIND diet pattern, wine is really the only food that is recommended at a very specific level. So it's really just that 5 ounces a day, no more, no less. If you have more than that, it's going to be harmful. But truly what they found was that there was an association that if people did incorporate this within an overall pattern on a daily basis, it did support a better score in terms of reducing the risk of dementia. Now, keep in mind that that's observational data. And so ultimately, wine is optional. This is something that is a quite personal choice. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there. Like, number one, we do have observational data that a low, moderate level is associated with better brain health outcomes, but high levels, of course, are not. Number two, you don't need to drink wine on the MIND diet. So the top scores of the MIND diet in the research still were not perfect. So following like 3/4 of the recommendations still got the best benefit as seen in the research. So you don't need it to get to therapeutic levels. And wine is not right for everybody. Alcohol is not right for everybody. And so if there are good reasons to avoid it, the MIND diet's not a reason to start. So yeah, so thank you so much for that question, because that's a really good one. It's a complicated area. And I know that there's research right now on the Mediterranean diet without wine, and what is the association of that to health outcomes that's underway. And so we are looking at that right now as a nutrition science community.
Thank you very much for that question, Natalia. It was something that was on my mind because I know recently there has been more and more suggestion that we should have no alcohol whatsoever. Like, it's just like
Right.
that, and in many ways. So yeah, it's helpful to hear that this is not something you have to do at all, that you can do really well in terms of your brain health without it.
Yep.
If you're going to drink it, here is the limited quantity in which it's been recommended.
Right.
Through the MIND diet evidence. Yeah.
I mean, just to follow up on that, and I know we've got another question, so I won't take long, but there was a study that used non-alcoholic wine. So you still got all the polyphenols from wine, and there was a benefit. So I'll just leave that there.
Okay. Oh.
What's the next question? I saw you come off camera. Come on, camera.
I have a question about pork, because I always go back and forth. I'm African American, so we have a lot of pork in our diet. And I know other cultures have pork in their diet as well. But as I've I've grown up eating a lot of pork, but as I've gotten older, I've heard, oh, that's not good. You shouldn't eat that food. So I just want to get your insight on, is pork a good brain healthy food, or just your insight on pork?
Well, I love that question. I also grew up eating pork, and fun fact, pork is actually the #1 protein eaten around the world, if you can believe it. Even though some cultures completely cut it out, it's still #1. I think poultry is close behind. So, so first I just want to say thank you for the question, and also that there are no good and bad foods. So it's not about, you know, there's no judgment on like whether a food is good or bad. It's just about the balance. So when it comes to pork, there are so many options, and you can 100% include it. It's a part of so many cultural foods, and you should feel good about enjoying it. I believe there are 3 cuts of pork that are actually American Heart Association heart check certified. So that's because today's pork, there are leaner cuts that really do support heart health. The other thing is that pork is a great source of B vitamins that we need to form neurotransmitters. So there are reasons to include that high biological value protein in the diet. Maybe just more often choosing the cuts that are going to be more supportive of overall heart and circulatory health, because the brain is it's so vascularized. There's so many blood vessels in the brain, which is why heart health and brain health are so closely linked. So I would look to those 3 that are really heart check certified by the American Heart Association. And maybe I could even look those up, and we could send those out as well to anyone who gave us their email. But, tender loin, so the word loin is a great hint about what's going to be leaner. So I hope that you continue to enjoy all the pork that you want, and find ways that make it work for you.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That helped a lot. Thank you.
Sure.
I had a quick question on coffee. I'm assuming, like wine, it's the quantity and how often you are taking that. But hate to admit it, a caffeine addict, but I just drink at least one and black with nothing in it.
Yeah. Well, for better or for worse, coffee is one of the top sources of antioxidants in the U.S. diet. Mostly because that's where we get a lot of our antioxidants, because we all love coffee. I love coffee as well, so we're together there. So the guideline is really to stay under 400 milligrams, and the average cup of coffee is about 100. So if you stay under 4, like small cups of coffee, that should be fine for the day. And there's even a lot of association. So there is some data on acute negative effects of caffeine and coffee, but it's really outweighed by a clear benefit and association between drinking coffee and some of the antioxidants and polyphenols you'll get from that coffee, to reducing the risk of diabetes, for example, which is a known risk factor for developing Alzheimer's. So keep it to the 1 cup, and I think we're good.
That's super helpful. I also think that a lot of culture drinking is like a part of their cultural practices as well. Natalia had one other question about oils. I've heard that most vegetable oils, canola, sunflower, for example, could possibly cause cancer.
Wow. Okay. So there is so much misinformation out there, and there's so much misinformation about seed oils. And yeah, there's just a lot of noise out there. And so the best available data that we have is that those oils are actually going to be helpful, not harmful. So an oil that is liquid at room temperature is going to be helpful, not harmful. And then if you want to get more bioactives, more polyphenols, more of these like phytonutrients, then the closer you get to like a first press, so like an extra virgin, whatever kind of oil, can be helpful. Now, the thing is, oils, like all foods, they degrade. So what I like to do is I like to make sure that I buy oils in darker bottles because oils are sensitive to light and heat, and then I buy them in just the amount that I need so that I can go through it um, in a shorter amount of time, because that's what's going to cause the oils to degrade and potentially create compounds from the degradation process that could be harmful eventually. But everyday use is going to be just fine. So please don't be afraid of liquid vegetable oils. It's a big misperception that creates a lot of confusion out there on the internet.
That's amazing. I had no idea. I also had these similar concerns about oils. I'm like, I need to eliminate all oils from my diet. So it's very,
No.
yeah.
No, I mean, we need them to absorb very important fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and K. Like we need
Right.
those oils. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This was super, super helpful. I'm glad that this is going to continue to be a resource that lives on Facebook, and we'll put it on our YouTube channel as well, maybe on our website too. Did you want to say anything in closing at all?
Well, I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you for coming on camera and asking those questions, and also for the questions in the chat. I would love to do this again. This is just really valuable to be able to interact in this intimate setting.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I do need to jump, so.
Thank you so much, Maggie.
Okay, bye.